I'm Sherry Kendall, and welcome to Hometown Salutes. I want to introduce my guest today. It's Fayette County veteran Brian Napier. Welcome, Brian, to the show.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about yourself. Where were you born and raised?
I was born at Rush Memorial, and I was raised all my life in Fayette County. Bought the place where I grew up. It's the only place I've ever lived.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah.
So when did you decide to join the National Guard, and how did that come about?
Well, my cousin was in the National Guard at the time, and it kind of reflected off of that, and he talked about some of the things they did, and I thought that sounded like a pretty cool idea, and it was 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer, and I thought it sounded like something I'd want to try out. So
How long of a commitment when you joined is that?
initially it was an 8-year term, but it was 6 years active, 2 years inactive. So once you did your 6 years, then you could get out, but you were still committed for another 2 years if something would happen and they needed to call you up. And then that changed over the years. Once I did the 6 years, I re-enlisted for, I think it was 4, and then I don't remember, 6 maybe. A total of 21 and a half years.
Wow.
You just re-enlist and for however many years at the time, and once you got to the end, if you wanted to get out, you could get out, or if you wanted to stay, you could re-enlist. And
Wow. So, but you still go through basic training just like everybody else, right?
yes, National Guard and active duty all do the same training.
Okay.
It's just the commitment is, at the time back then, was 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer, which now the National Guard is a lot more than that. They do a lot more days.
It's changed.
And it's changed over the years, yeah.
Okay. Where did you go to basic training at?
I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and like I said, between my junior and senior year, and then came back home and then went back to Fort Knox, Kentucky for AIT, which I was 3 weeks late getting to basic training because of my job. I worked at the machine shop out at Springersville, and I was countersinking some parts, and it spun out and hit my hand. I ended up having to go to the hospital and get stitches, and the day I went to MEPS in Indianapolis was the day the stitches were supposed to come out. So the doctor up there told me I had to come back here, get the stitches out, and then turn around and go back up there, and I was 3 weeks late. And at the time when we went back down there was when the Greyhound buses were getting attacked on the interstates. So they flew us from Indianapolis to Louisville, which was like 25-minute flight.
You have to say up and down.
I'd never flown on an airplane before in my life, so that was a new experience. So I got down there late, and they ended up putting me in the holdover platoon, which we didn't have a purpose, so we got to mow grass and weed eat and stuff like that. I was there for a month, and I went and saw the National Guard liaison, and I asked him when the next cycle was, and this was July, I think, and he said September. So I said, well, just send me home and I'll come back in September. And he said, okay. So I went back the next day to get my paperwork and stuff to come home. And he said, good news, we got you in a training slot, which they did a split option, which is what I did, and then they did it called OSIT, One Station Unit Training. He got me into that cycle, and they were in their 7th week of basic training. So I didn't do anything for the week that I was there with them. I did KP pretty much every day. And then once I got in their training cycle, they were training on the Bradley. I was supposed to train on the M113 armored vehicle. And we didn't use a Bradley after that, but I got to train on one of them for, several weeks. So it was a lot of fun to drive, but didn't get one since.
So, had you traveled a lot before you joined the military?
No.
No?
Mm-mm.
I mean, I can't imagine you were pretty young to go to basic training.
Yeah, 17.
Were you the youngest one in your group?
Probably.
Yeah.
I can't remember say for sure because that's been a lot of years ago, but I mean, we did, the vacations to Tennessee, Florida and stuff like that, but nothing out of the country at all.
Right. Did you come from a military family?
I did. My grandfather was in World War I, and then my cousin that was in the Guard, and then after I joined the Guard, he left and went to active duty and was in the Army for several years.
Oh, wow.
So there was a couple of us.
Yep. So let's go back to what exactly is AIT? What does that stand for?
AIT is your Advanced Individual Training. That's your job specific.
Okay, and then your job Pacific was, what did you do?
The Cavalry Scout.
The Cavalry Scout.
Yeah, it was reconnaissance, surveillance. We're supposed to go out, and we work for the battalion commander, and we're supposed to go out and gather intelligence on the battlefield and relay that back to the battalion commander so he can decide where he wants to place the rest of the troops.
Okay. So after AIT training, did you get deployed at that point?
Not at that point. I eventually did get deployed, but we did the security for the Olympics in Atlanta in '96, and then I went to England for 2 weeks and trained with the British, and then I eventually got deployed to Afghanistan in '04, '05, and then Iraq in '07 and '08.
Okay. So let's talk about each deployment. The first one you said was Afghanistan or Iraq?
Afghanistan was the first one.
Okay. So how was that as you got there?
It was a culture shock, I guess, if you want to put it that way. But when we landed, we landed at the Kabul International Airport. So it was kind of a civilian, military, both airport they were using. And then they bussed us over to Camp Phoenix, where we stayed at. We did dismounted and mounted patrols through the local village. We'd go out and interact with the civilians, and kids would run up to us, and we didn't understand what they were wanting for a little while, but they would come up and say, "Mr. Biscuit, Mr. Biscuit." We couldn't figure out what biscuits were, but eventually we found out that the British did patrols, and they call cookies biscuits. And they were handing out cookies to the kids. So the kids didn't know any better. They were asking us for cookies, and we're like, "I don't know what you want."
Oh, funny.
And we did base security. We did, I call it mounted. We were in four-door Ford Rangers. That's what we had for vehicles. And we drive up to Bagram Airfield and did route clearance and stuff like that.
Were you ever in like a scary situation? You personally, were you ever in a terrifying situation when you were over there, or not really?
Well, we were responsible, like I said, for base security, and we rotated days off, and my squad was actually on the front gate, and for whatever reason I had the day off, and they called them bazaars. It's basically the civilians came in and they would sell their various things. They had like copied DVDs that somebody sat in a theater and filmed. You could see people's heads getting up and go through there. But I was walking through there and I heard gunfire at the front gate, so I went down there to see what was going on, and it was a civilian that had came towards the front gate and was waving a gun, and there was two French guys that were pulling into our front gate, because we had international forces over there. There was the British, the Germans, and the French. They all had their own bases, but they would come in and out of ours, and they shot the guy, and we went out and secured him and brought him in, and then the medical staff came down and got him. They flew him to Bagram, but he eventually ended up dying from his wounds. But that got a little hairy.
Yeah. And then you said one of the pictures that you had sent, there were 4 guys that did get killed. Was that in Afghanistan? Yeah,
that was in Afghanistan. I was in Herat at the time because we rotated security down there, and they were out looking for a new range for the ANA, which we trained with, It's the Afghan National Army. And they drove over, they went through a riverbed, and they called them migrating landmines because they would, when it didn't rain very often in Afghanistan, but when it did, it rained a lot, and it would wash the landmines, move them around. And they drove over one of those, and they were in a Toyota Hilux vehicle, and it destroyed the vehicle and killed all 4 of them.
Ugh. So did you have any downtime?
We did. In Afghanistan, in Afghanistan and Iraq both, we had gyms. They were real supportive or wanting us to, to do physical training to, keep your strength up and
Stay
in shape. And we had a PX. It was makeshift, and you could go in there and buy various things that you needed, and snacks and drinks and stuff like that. And they eventually put in a pizza shop, and then when we would take our trips to Bagram, they had Burger King and it's basically a little semi-trailer that you could go up and order.
Yeah.
It wasn't the same Burger King type stuff we have here, but it was the same principle.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
So you said like you would take there was a shorter trip to go from.
That was in Iraq.
Oh, that was in Iraq.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. So there was a short trip that you could take.
Yeah, when we were in Iraq, we did convoy security. They were English-speaking American truck drivers that had basically armored semis, and then we had our armored vehicles that we would escort. We did, it was BIOP, Baghdad International Airport, and Ramadi, Fallujah, Al Assad. We would deliver fuel and water, and then there are a couple of Marine bases that we would take fuel and water out to them too, because they had a water purification plant there at TQ that they were purifying the water out of Lake Habbaniyah. And
Okay.
then we would deliver it. But when we go to Fallujah, if we could go the short route and go through Fallujah, then it was 25-minute trip maybe. But if there was something going on in Fallujah and intelligence didn't want us to go through Fallujah, we had to go the long route, which took like 8 hours.
Jeez.
So it was less than a half-hour trip versus an 8-hour trip. And if we had to go the long route, then we would stay the night or day, because we ran our convoys at night. We would stay in Fallujah, and then we'd come back the next day.
That is crazy. Wow. So military friends, did you keep in contact with them?
I did.
Are they all from here?
No, there are some from here, but like I said, when we would have home station drills here, then the guys from around the state would come here, and then when we got Saturday night off, they didn't want to drive all the way back home, so we started kind of a tradition that we'd all go out to my house, and we'd go out back and shoot guns, drink beer, and hang out and have a good time. And we kind of continued that tradition after we all got out, and once a year we'd all get together again, and we'd go out to my house and shoot guns, drink beer. And I stayed in touch with a few, but it's like anything else, after a while you
Lose touch.
You drift apart, and we haven't had what we called a scout party in a while. And the last 2 or 3 times we've all gotten together as a group, it's been for a funeral of somebody that we served with. So every time we get together, we're like, hey, we need to have another scout party.
It's hard to get it to happen.
Yeah.
So when you were in the service, how did you communicate with your family then?
We actually had the internet in Afghanistan and Iraq both, so we could, emails or video chat if you could get a decent enough connection. They had phone stations there that we had phone cards, so it didn't cost us anything to call home. So even if we went to Ramadi or Fallujah, we could still call,
Okay.
you know. I mean, we had decent communication back home, and then, you know, you'd send letters, it didn't cost anything to mail anything, so you just put a address on it and
Send it off.
send it. And
So did the people in both places, Iraq and Afghanistan, did they treat you nice?
we didn't really interact with the civilian population in Iraq, other than, you know, passing them on the road, because we just drove from base to base, and, you know, unless we stopped while we were on the
the
road, then, you know, and even then we didn't interact with them. You know, we just drove past them. And I guess that was the difference between the Afghanistan and Iraq deployment was, you know, Afghanistan, we got to interact with the people and the kids, and we did a couple. There was a little girl that they brought to our base that she broke her leg somehow, and the doctor wanted to go check on her. So he found out where she lived, and he came and got us and said, hey, can you take me over there? Basically did a house call.
Yeah.
You know, so we're pulling security, and this doctor's over there checking this little girl out, and, you know, she did fine.
You said when you got to Afghanistan, you could interact with the kids, with the children?
Yeah.
And you said they'd come up to you?
Yeah, and when we were out on patrol, you knew that as long as the kids were out there running around, and you really didn't have much to worry about. But if we went out on a patrol and there wasn't too many people around, then you had to be a little more aware of,
Yeah.
you know, what was going on. So the kids were kind of a sign that, you know, you could
It was safe,
say, yeah, basically.
hopefully. And then they would ask you guys for, what did you say, biscuits?
Biscuits, yeah.
And nobody knew what that was for a while?
No. No, it took us, we were probably there for about a month before we finally figured out. You know, we'd actually went over to the British compound, and that's how we discovered that, oh, they're called cookies biscuits.
So there are a couple of these pictures, like you're at a coffee shop?
Yeah, they had it was called Green Beans Coffee. They were open 24 hours. So when we'd go to the other bases, and we would drop the KBR guys off, and they'd go download their fuel or unload their water and stuff like that, we'd all go over to the coffee shop, and we'd coffee or, you know, Frappuccino or whatever they had, and we'd sit out on the back deck and drink our coffee until the KBR guys let us know they were ready to go.
The one picture, you graduated from PLDC. What, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, you had
What
to
that
take,
means?
back then it was called PLDC, it's Primary Leadership and Development Course.
Okay.
You had to have that to get promoted to E5, which is Sergeant. And that picture, we actually did our class at Atterbury, and then went up to the Indianapolis to the War Memorial,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's where we had our graduation at.
Okay. And so then from that point, you were an E5?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us a little bit, when did you get out of the Guard?
I got out in 2010, I think is when I finally got out. After we came back from Iraq, me and another guy, we put in a job at Atterbury. It was called Operation Warrior Trainer, and they were taking people that had just come back fresh from the theater of operations, and we would train other units that were going to Iraq where we had just came from.
Okay.
So when I worked down there for another year, you know, after I came back from deployment, but I was able to travel back and forth, come home and work down there. And then after that's when I decided enough was enough and
Got out.
got out.
So did you use what you learned in the military? Did you use that in your on the civilian side?
Not at all.
Not at all?
No. Not much civilian jobs for
Right.
reconnaissance and surveillance.
Right. So what did you do? Tell me a little bit about your family now and what you do.
Well, I did. Like I said, I did EMS. Well, I'm still a paramedic. I kept my cert. But I did EMS for 20-some years, and I worked for the city, first aid unit, for 18 years.
Wow.
And I found Ivy Tech had a medic to RN transition program. That was 3 semesters, I think it was. Well, when I investigated a little further, I found out that you had to have a bunch of prerequisites that I had 0 college. And so I had to take like 6 semesters of prerequisites to do the 3 semesters of nursing.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, that was interesting.
I was going to say, how'd that go over?
Well, I was 40 years old going to school with, a bunch of 18-year-old kids that, just got out of high school. And
That's funny.
my first algebra class, I remember the instructor, he wrote a bunch of stuff on the board, and he's like, all right, does everybody get that? And, of course, all the, 18-year-olds are like, oh, yeah, we got it. And he looked at me, and I'm like, I have no clue what you're talking about. So that was a struggle, but luckily I had good instructors that helped me out and
Yeah, that's
got
awesome.
through it and got through the nursing part of it. And I actually started, it was still Fayette Regional then, but since it's transitioned to Reed, but I started working in the ER there because it's paramedic emergency medicine to the emergency room. Working in there just seemed like a
good fit.
a good transition.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the military actually paid for my college with the GI Bill.
Oh, wow.
So didn't cost me anything to go to college other than books and stuff like that they didn't pay for, but they paid 100% of the tuition.
Wow.
So I come out not owing a dime.
Yeah, that's nice.
So that worked out well.
So are you married, family?
Yeah, married, wife, 2 kids.
Do the kids, are they home or older?
One just turned 21 and the other's 17. My son's 21. He's considering the military. He's not quite sure what he wants to do yet.
So how do you feel about that?
I support it for him. I've told him I'd help him out, and because I didn't have really anybody that kind of guide me. There's some things in the military I probably should have done different, but I didn't have anybody to point me in the right direction.
Right.
So if he chooses to do so, then I'd help him out along the way.
Does it scare you how times are right now, how things are so crazy
Yeah.
for him to sign up?
I mean, it's
a thing to do, though.
we knew the risk, or we know the risks, and
Right.
the world's an ever-changing place, so you never know what's going to happen. Every time you turn around, there's something popping up somewhere else.
Right. So are you glad you joined the National Guard?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I got to see and do that I wouldn't have got to do otherwise. I don't regret any of it. Like I said, there were some things that I probably, would have done different. But
You were so young going in, too, and you saw a lot. What are some life lessons that you learned?
keep copies of everything. Because if you lose it, then it didn't happen, especially your medical records. Because if they give you a shot and you lost your medical record and you couldn't prove that you got it, you were going to get it again.
Really?
Yeah.
So that happened to you?
Oh, yeah. Yep. Keep copies of everything was a good lesson learned.
Wow. So what do you do? Are you in the Patriot Guard, or what do you do now?
I was in the Patriot Guard. I was actually East Central Ride Captain at one time. I'm the chapter president of the U.S. Military Vets Motorcycle Club in Richmond.
Okay.
As where our chapter is based out of. So it's a requirement to be a veteran to be in our motorcycle club. So once you get out, you kind of get away from the camaraderie and the connections through the military. And the guys I worked with at Atterbury was actually how I found out about the motorcycle club. And I worked with those guys, on a daily basis, and they talked about it. And I was like, well, it's kind of, the same camaraderie and same connections. So I got into that and have made more friends, more connections that, through other military veterans that I wouldn't have got to do otherwise.
Right.
We have chapters all over the country, so there's always something going on somewhere. So if you got a weekend off and You can ride to Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Florida, you know, wherever there's something going on somewhere. There's always a chapter having a party, or if you're on the road, broke down, and, you know, you call somebody in that state and say, hey, you know, can you give me a hand? And, you know, so it's a good connections to have.
Yeah, that's awesome. So is there anything, before we wind up, anything else you want to talk about your time with the National Guard? Or your time, what you're doing now?
It was, like I said, I got to see and do a lot of things I wouldn't have got to do otherwise.
Yeah.
When I started, we were in quarter-ton Jeeps that, you know, my first AIT, or AT, annual training, was at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and there was 4 grown men in a quarter-ton Jeep pulling a trailer, and each of us had 2 duffel bags in the trailer, so that was a little sketchy going down the interstate.
Yeah.
You know, the whole thing swaying the whole time you're going down there.
Oh, gosh.
But it evolved over the years, and then, you know, we're up to the Humvees and the other
That's crazy.
armored vehicles that they've got now, so a lot changed over the years.
Yeah. It's funny how you can sit back and, I mean, you experienced it. I mean, you were there at the beginning. Now look how things have evolved.
Yeah, it's strange, you know, to look back on it. And say, wow, you know.
Because we're really not that old.
Oh, no,
You know?
no, not at all.
Well, Brian, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your service and your sacrifice. And I want to thank you for taking time out to come into the studio to tape the show.
Thanks for having me. I've always said that, you know, the families and everybody that was left back here, you know, I feel like they sacrificed more than we did, because, you know, we just went over and did a job and, you know, tried to stay alive, and they had to take care of everything,
Yep.
you know, here, back home, the wife and kids, you know, everybody, you know, they had to keep up with everything here at home, so.
Yeah, it's hard on families. Yeah. But, well, thank you, Brian, and just be sure to tune in next month as we'll highlight another veteran from Fayette County.